Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. Now, it may sound strange or odd, but there are people out there, including a few professional historians, you could basically count those on one hand, who think that Jesus never actually existed. Now, to make that claim, the New Testament, of course, has to be abandoned and ruled out as a historical source. That might sound unreasonable, and I think it is, to say the least, but nevertheless, people do it. Now, that doesn't nail the case down, though, as far as arguing that Jesus, isn't real, that he never really existed. Why not? Well, there are a lot of other external sources to the New Testament that either say Jesus existed, in other words, they mention him, or they strongly suggest it. You would have to argue that those sources don't count either, or somehow dismiss them from the question. Now, the question for us today, though, is, does this make sense? Is this real? Is it really true that even outside the New Testament, there are no sources to validate the existence of Jesus of Nazareth? Is that really the case? Well, the answer to that question is no, that is not true. There are classical sources, Greco-Roman material, and of course ancient Jewish sources that mention Jesus. In this episode of Fringe Pop, we're going to take a look at the classical sources that validate the existence of Jesus outside the New Testament. Now, as I just noted in this episode of Fringe Pop, we're taking a look at classical sources, Greco-Roman material, that witness Jesus in some way. Some of those references in classical sources are pretty indirect. For example, Thales trying to explain the darkness at the crucifixion via a solar eclipse. Now, Jesus isn't specifically mentioned by name in his source or his explanation, but the precise circumstances of his death are. So this is sort of an oblique, kind of implicit reference. For us, we're looking for more direct attestations of Jesus of Nazareth in these sources, so not something so indirect. The Roman writer Pliny the Younger is actually a better example. Now, Pliny lived circa 61 to 113 AD, and he mentions Jesus explicitly in his last book of letters, that is, Letter 96, Book 10. This work is Pliny's correspondence with the Emperor Trajan. And the body of the letter begins by explaining Pliny's doubts about the trials of Christians. Pliny has several questions for Trajan. First, how should Christians be punished, and on what grounds? Are Christians to be punished just for being Christians, or should we look for other crimes? Now, Pliny then gives Trajan a report of how he has been conducting trials of Christians on his own turf. And eventually, he mentions Jesus, quote, I decided to dismiss any who denied that they are or ever have been Christians, when they repeated after me a formula invoking the gods and made offerings of wine and incense to your image, which I had ordered to be brought with the images of the gods into court for this reason, and when they reviled Christ, unquote. Now, Pliny adds that those who ended up denying Christ, quote, also maintained that the sum total of their guilt or error was no more than the following. They had met regularly before dawn on a determined day and sung antiphonally a hymn to Christ as if to a god, unquote. While it's true that referencing Christ can have no other person in mind than Jesus of Nazareth, skeptics insist that though the words are clear, none are actual references to the historical Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth. They instead describe the worship of a mythic object of devotion, again in the mind of the skeptic. So more than Pliny is needed to satisfy these kind of folks. Now, a reference to the Jesus of history, that is Jesus of Nazareth, as opposed to Christ, that title, is more transparent in the writings of Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, who lived circa 70 to 140 AD. Suetonius was a Roman lawyer and contemporary of Pliny the Younger. In the 5th book of his work, Lives of the Caesars, we read the following about the Emperor Claudius. Quote, "He," Claudius in context, "expelled the Jews from Rome, since they were always making disturbances because of the instigator Chrestus." Unquote. Now note the spelling there, Chrestus, not Christus, which would be expected in Latin. Not surprisingly, this is an issue of debate. Opinion among scholars that Christus equals Jesus Christ is nearly unanimous among historians. But of course, nearly isn't total. There are some skeptics who object to this. Robert Van Voorst, author of a recent thorough work on all the external ancient references to Jesus, says this, quote, "Nothing in this sentence or its context explicitly indicates that Suetonius is writing about Christ or Christianity. Also, none of the copyists of the surviving manuscripts of Lives, which date from the 9th to the 15th centuries, ventured to change Cresto into Christo. This indicates that Cresto made some sense as it stands." Unquote. Now, Van Voorst is not someone who thinks Jesus did not exist. For those who doubt he existed, their opposition to Suetonius' material follows 2 points. Number one, Suetonius would not have written Christus if he was thinking of Jesus the Christ, because Christus was a common Latin name. And second, elsewhere Suetonius spells the closely related word Christiani correctly, which perhaps suggests that he would have written Christus if he was referring to the leading figure, historically, of Christianity. Now, most historians are not persuaded by these objections, and so we have to ask why. There are 3 lines of rebuttal. First, we know from other sources that Claudius did expel Jews from Rome, among whom were many followers of Jesus, the historical figure, so there's no other logical referent for Christus than Jesus. Second, Christus is a common name for Romans, but never occurs in ancient Roman sources for a Jew. Recall that Suetonius' statement refers to Jews. A Gentile, i.e. a Roman, hearing Christus as a name would not have been confused by it and written it as the common Gentile name Christus. So that's a second issue. Third, Christus was often confused with Christus, as we can imagine, by non-Christians and sometimes even by Christians. This confusion arose from 2 sources, one of meaning and one of sound. Now, some elaboration on this is a bit necessary, so we understand the point. Due to a widespread phonetic feature of Greek, Christus and Christus were even closer in pronunciation than they appear to us today. Hellenistic Greek featured an almost complete overlapping of the sounds of iota, that's I, short I, and eta, the longer e, a, eta. Now, I just made a phonetic distinction between the iota and the eta, but back in this period, they were pronounced so similarly that they were often confused by the uneducated and even the educated alike, according to texts that we have, in both speech and writing. Francis T. Gignac has fully documented this phenomenon and concluded, this interchange of eta with iota and epsilon iota reflects the phonological development of the Greek koine language, in which the sound originally represented by generally eta merged with iota by the 2nd century AD. Now let me parse that a little bit. Basically what Gignac is saying is at this time, these 2 vowels were virtually indistinguishable. The sounds of the native speakers for each of them basically merged and overlapped. And so this spelling issue may not really be much of an issue at all anyway. Now, the same confusion is witnessed in Latin sources. It is entirely reasonable, then, to conclude that behind Suetonius' Christus may in fact be Christus, Christ, again, the Jesus of history at the time of which Suetonius is speaking, Claudius' expulsion of Jews from Rome. And basically everyone but the most desperate Jesus deniers would acknowledge that. Let's remember as well that in the book of Acts, This expulsion under Claudius is alluded to, and the context is very clear. It is followers of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. Our next source is Tacitus. Now, Tacitus is considered by many classical historians as ancient Rome's greatest historian. In chapters 38 to 45 of his Annals, Tacitus discusses the great fire of Rome under Nero. Now, even at the time of events, many suspected Nero of having ordered the fire for personal reasons. Tacitus alludes to such suspicions, but for our purposes, we're more interested in this portion of his accounting. Quote, "Neither human effort nor the emperor's generosity nor the placating of the gods ended the scandalous belief that the fire had been ordered. Therefore, to put down the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished in the most unusual ways those hated for their shameful acts, whom the crowd called Christians. The founder of this name, Christus, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate." Unquote. Now, all of this seems pretty clear. The passage does have some textual issues, but it exists in several manuscripts. The word translated Christians appears as Christianoi, but some manuscripts have a scribal correction in the margins to Christianoi. Christianoi is likely then more original. Now, that Tacitus intends to speak of Christians, though, is pretty obvious regardless of the spelling issue. If not Christians, then Christianoi would mean, in the language, good, useful ones. But Tacitus labels these people as criminals, hated for their shameful acts. Followers of Jesus hated by Rome are obviously the referent, again, regardless of the spelling. The context makes this clear. As if the overall context weren't obvious enough, the leader of this hated sect was crucified by Pontius Pilate in Tacitus's material. Tacitus is clearly referring to Jesus, a real person crucified by Rome. By way of conclusion, it's pretty desperate to insist that Jesus did not exist in light of Greco-Roman sources. Now, sure, the sources aren't perfect. Yes, there are some manuscript issues. Yes, there are some scribal comments in margins. Yes, there's a spelling discrepancy or at least a confusion, but the contexts for all of these references are quite clear. And this isn't all of our external sources either. We're going to have another episode of Fringe Pop where we focus on Jewish sources. So it's not just Greco-Roman material, and that's good material. We also have more. So we have to ask, why the desperation? Why is this such an issue? And for some, they just don't want Jesus to exist because maybe they're threatened by that with their own accountability. Thanks again for watching Fringe Pop 321. Please watch our other episodes and our entire series on Jesus. Whether he existed or not, it's very important. Don't forget to visit our website as well. That's fp321.com, because what you know may not be so.